Welcome, and settle in. You're listening to Boring History for Sleep, where the past gently unfolds in quiet detail, perfect for winding down after a long day. If you're new here, feel free to like or subscribe, but only if you enjoy what you hear. For now, just get comfortable, dim the lights, and let the soft rhythm of the past carry you into rest. Tonight's story takes us deep into the world of medieval medicine, a time when illness was mysterious, treatment was experimental, and doctors worked with equal parts curiosity, courage, and superstition. Before there were hospitals as we know them, before germs were understood, before painkillers dulled the ache, doctors walked into the unknown with crude instruments and unshakable confidence. But what was it really like to be one of those doctors? Not the modern kind with degrees and sterile gloves, but a medieval physician, navigating beliefs about humors and spirits, tending to the sick with herbs and leeches, and trying desperately to help, often in ways that today would make us cringe. Over the next 12 chapters, we'll walk beside one such doctor. You'll see his world, from his early studies and strange textbooks to the patients he treats, the tools he uses, and the sometimes unsettling remedies he trusts. We'll visit cramped village huts and echoing monastery infirmaries, observe strange surgeries and whispered prayers, and even join him as he consults the stars for medical insight. So if you're ready, breathe in gently, and let yourself drift back in time. The lantern is lit, the apothecary jars are lined in rows, and the doctor's worn leather bag is packed and ready. You're about to discover what it was like to be a medieval doctor. Just close your eyes, and let the past begin. In a small stone town nestled among winding roads and misty forests, the road to becoming a medieval doctor began not with a lab or classroom, but often in the halls of a monastery or beneath the roof of a learned noble's estate. Education in medicine was not a right but a rare privilege, afforded only to a few, and even those lucky enough to pursue it had to travel a path lined with uncertainty, tradition, and deeply rooted beliefs about the body and soul. The idea of going to medical school, as we know it, didn't exist in the early centuries of the Middle Ages. Instead, medicine was passed down like folklore, preserved in manuscripts that were carefully copied by hand and sometimes understood only in fragments. A young boy destined to become a physician may have first been introduced to learning through the church. Monasteries served not only as religious centers but also as the guardians of ancient knowledge, including that of Hippocrates, Galen, and other early thinkers. These texts were written in Latin, a language many common folk never learned, meaning a future doctor first had to become literate, a remarkable achievement by itself. Long days were spent hunched over parchment, tracing the sweeping shapes of letters, learning to read aloud and translate not just words but ideas older than castles. It was in these early lessons that a student would begin to hear about the four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, and how the body, according to long-held belief, was a delicate balance of these substances. The young student was expected to understand not only the body but also the soul. In the medieval mind, physical illness and spiritual imbalance were often linked. Disease was not simply a matter of germs or bad food, but could be seen as a test of faith, a punishment for sin, or even the result of celestial alignments. Astrology, theology, and medicine formed a strange but inseparable triad. As such, early medical students might study alongside theologians, learning not only about anatomy but also about the stars and sacred rites. The human body was seen as a reflection of the universe, a fragile system of elements governed by divine design. To heal the body, one might have to purify the soul, or perhaps wait for a favorable planetary alignment. Not every doctor began in the cloistered quiet of a monastery. In more urban centers, especially as the High Middle Ages unfolded, universities began to emerge as formal places of learning. Places like Salerno, Bologna, and later Paris became hubs of academic study. These universities often admitted only men from certain social classes, and the cost of study was steep, not always in coin, but in years of patience and perseverance. Students traveled long distances on foot or horseback to study with masters who read aloud from ancient texts, pausing only for discussion or dictation. It wasn't unusual for a classroom to revolve around a single book, with students copying its contents by hand as the teacher read line by line. The curriculum for these budding physicians was slow, methodical, and heavily focused on theory. Dissection of human bodies was rare and often prohibited, meaning much of what was taught came from inherited beliefs rather than observed fact. Galen's texts, written more than 1,000 years earlier, were considered near sacred. His ideas on anatomy, drawn from animal dissection, remained unchallenged for centuries. To question Galen was to question not only science but authority itself. Even when observation suggested otherwise, a medieval student might find themselves told they had misunderstood the body, not that the ancient master had been mistaken. Yet despite these limitations, medical study required great dedication. The Latin terms were difficult, the texts dense, and the principles often abstract. Days were long and food was modest, bread, broth, and sometimes cheese, yet the mind of the future doctor was always working. He would memorize long lists of symptoms and treatments, learn the properties of dozens of herbs, and study the relationships between body parts as defined not by muscles and organs, but by elemental theory. The head was linked to air, the chest to fire, the belly to water, and the limbs to earth. These connections shaped how doctors would diagnose and treat illnesses for generations. Beyond books, an aspiring physician needed to observe real illness, and so, once enough knowledge had been absorbed, he might begin an apprenticeship with an older doctor. This stage of training was crucial. Now, the young student would see things no book could fully describe: fevers that ravaged the body, skin rashes of unknown cause, aching joints, pale faces, and the frailty of life. He might help mix medicines from powdered roots and dried flowers, prepare poultices to soothe burns, or administer purgatives meant to drive out sickness through the bowels. He would learn how to handle patients, how to listen to their complaints, and how to respond with authority even when unsure. One common early task for an apprentice was preparing leeches, a staple in medieval medicine. Bloodletting was believed to rebalance the humors, and leeches were used to draw blood gently from the patient's skin. Harvested from marshes or purchased from leech traders, these slimy creatures were kept in damp jars and applied carefully to veins. Watching them swell with blood was thought to be a sign of success. The apprentice might also help in the preparation of tinctures, using wine or vinegar to extract the properties of healing plants like chamomile, yarrow, and valerian. Mortar and pestle in hand, he would grind and mix under the close eye of his mentor, learning the proportions and timing that could make the difference between relief and agony. But medicine in the medieval world was not only a physical pursuit. The apprentice was also expected to learn how to counsel, comfort, and, at times, deliver grim news. He might accompany his master to the homes of the sick, where straw-stuffed mattresses lined stone floors and candles flickered low. He would see the fear in the eyes of families, hear their whispered prayers, and learn to remain calm even when hope was fading. Medicine was not about curing in the modern sense. It was about managing suffering, preserving dignity, and offering what little help could be found in an uncertain world. The social standing of a doctor was often a strange mix of respect and suspicion. Learned and literate, he was considered wise, but medicine's connection to astrology and mysticism also made some uneasy. If a treatment worked, the doctor might be praised as a gift from God. If it failed, whispers of incompetence or worse might follow. To guard against this, apprentices were taught not only medical knowledge but also how to speak carefully, how to present themselves, and how to navigate the delicate balance between confidence and humility. Eventually, after years of study, practice, and endurance, the apprentice would become a doctor in his own right. But even then, learning never truly ended. Every village and town brought new illnesses, new herbal remedies, and new challenges. What he had learned in books might be contradicted by what he saw in the field, yet he was expected to carry forward the traditions of his training while adapting to the realities before him. He would build his own collection of tools: a bone-handled scalpel, a brass urinal for examining urine, a box of dried herbs, a few trusted charms. These items, both practical and symbolic, would travel with him wherever he went. To become a medieval doctor was to commit not only to a profession but to a lifetime of observation, interpretation, and sometimes desperation. The path was long and uncertain, but for those who walked it, There was no higher calling than to ease the suffering of others, even with limited knowledge and primitive tools. It was a path of mystery, faith, and above all, quiet courage, the kind that grew not from certainty, but from the willingness to face the unknown. To the untrained eye, the contents of a medieval doctor's satchel might have appeared more suited to a traveling merchant or a craftsman than a medical professional. There were no gleaming scalpels laid out in sterilized trays, no clean gauze or antiseptics in labeled bottles. Instead, a strange and often unsettling collection of instruments filled the bag: iron tongs with curled ends, knives of varying lengths and sharpness, small wooden boxes filled with herbs and powders, leather-bound volumes of handwritten recipes, bits of string, cloth, glass, and bone. To the doctor, however, every item had a purpose, every tool a history, and every object, no matter how crude, was a potential bridge between suffering and relief. The medieval doctor's toolkit was an extension of his training, experience, and personal beliefs. Because no two physicians practiced in exactly the same way, each one developed preferences for certain methods and instruments. Some favored herbs and prayer, others relied more heavily on bloodletting and astrology. But there were tools that almost all medieval doctors carried, the essentials, if you will, for tending to a body whose secrets were still largely unknown. Among the most important were the implements used for bleeding, a treatment based on the belief that disease stemmed from an imbalance of the four humors. To restore that balance, excess blood needed to be removed, and so the physician would use either a lancet, a small, pointed blade, or apply leeches, which had to be stored in damp containers and monitored regularly to keep them alive. The process of bloodletting was not casual or random. Doctors believed that specific veins corresponded with different organs and afflictions. A wound made near the elbow might be intended to relieve headaches, while one behind the knee could be used for digestive complaints. Charts known as bleeding maps were sometimes consulted, showing the body crisscrossed with vein paths and marked with the zodiac symbols that governed each body part. A skilled doctor was expected to know not just how much blood to draw, but when, aligning his actions with lunar cycles or planetary positions. The logic behind this practice was flawed by modern standards, but in its time, it was seen as a precise and thoughtful intervention. In addition to tools for letting blood, the doctor also carried instruments for inspecting and diagnosing. Chief among these was the urinal flask, a simple glass vessel shaped like a bulb with a long neck. Doctors used these to collect and examine a patient's urine, believing its color, clarity, and even aroma could reveal the state of the body. Yellow, red, white, or black tints might suggest different humoral imbalances, and the presence of sediment or cloudiness could indicate internal trouble. Some doctors had urine charts or wheels with color-coded diagrams to assist their interpretation. Patients would sometimes bring urine samples to the physician rather than visit in person, making diagnosis a matter of sight and smell alone. Beyond the urinal flask were a variety of other diagnostic tools, though none matched today's precision. Physicians often relied on touch, pressing their fingers to a patient's pulse and noting its speed or irregularity. They would examine the tongue, feel the forehead for heat, and listen carefully as the patient described their symptoms. But even in listening, the doctor's questions were shaped by humoral theory. A persistent cough might be traced to an excess of phlegm, while sudden anger or agitation could be seen as signs of an overheated liver and too much yellow bile. These interpretations were not random but grounded in centuries-old texts that shaped every aspect of medieval medicine. For treatment, the doctor turned to his apothecary kit, a collection of jars, vials, cloth pouches, and handwritten scrolls. Herbal remedies were the cornerstone of medieval healing. Dried plants like wormwood, horehound, mint, and sage were ground into powders or boiled into teas. Ointments made from animal fat and beeswax were infused with lavender or rosemary and applied to wounds. Honey, known for its preservative and antibacterial qualities, was used generously in mixtures meant to soothe coughs or dress infections. The doctor often mixed his own remedies, following recipes passed down through generations, sometimes altering the dosage or ingredients based on intuition or the severity of the illness. Each preparation required care, precision, and sometimes a dash of bold guesswork. In some cases, a more direct intervention was needed, and this was when the surgical tools came out. These were not the polished instruments of a modern operating theater, but rough, utilitarian objects, long, thin needles for suturing, bone saws for amputations, forceps for tooth extractions or pulling foreign objects from the flesh. Some doctors owned cautery irons, metal rods heated in a fire and pressed against wounds to stop bleeding or burn out infection. This method, terrifying by today's standards, was considered necessary in an age without antiseptics. The pain was immense, and patients were often restrained or held down by family members. The smell of burning flesh was something the doctor learned to ignore, as were the cries of his patients. He could offer no anesthetic beyond strong wine, herbs like mandrake or henbane, or perhaps a whispered prayer. The doctor's attire was also part of his toolkit in a way. While most medieval physicians wore clothing similar to other educated men of their time, tunics, cloaks, and occasionally scholarly caps, some adopted more distinctive garb, especially during times of widespread illness. The image of the plague doctor, clad in a long robe, gloves, and a bird-like mask filled with aromatic herbs, would not emerge until the later Middle Ages and Renaissance, but even before then, doctors recognized the importance of protecting themselves from contagion. They might cover their mouths with cloths soaked in vinegar, wear gloves when tending to sores, or carry scented sachets they believed could ward off bad air, which was thought to carry disease. One of the more mysterious items in a doctor's possession might be an astrolabe or set of star charts. Astrology played a significant role in medical decision-making. Certain times of day or specific celestial arrangements were believed to influence the success of treatments. A doctor might delay a procedure if the moon was in the wrong phase or advise against certain foods based on the day's ruling planet. This was not seen as superstition, but as part of a larger understanding of the universe's harmony. Just as tides were moved by the moon, so too were the humors within the body affected by the stars. Alongside physical tools, doctors carried mental ones, the knowledge stored in memory, the teachings of Hippocrates and Galen, the lessons learned from other healers. But perhaps the most important tool of all was the doctor's judgment. In a world where medical science was more art than certainty, the physician had to assess each situation with care. Should a fever be treated with cooling herbs or induced sweating? Was the illness divine punishment, best left to prayer, or a physical imbalance that called for intervention? These decisions were made without lab results or x-rays, only the doctor's instincts, experience, and the occasional glance toward the heavens. Though many doctors kept their equipment in portable leather cases or wooden chests, wealthier physicians had dedicated rooms or cabinets filled with labeled drawers and lined shelves. The smell of dried herbs and vinegar soaked the walls, and light filtered in through narrow windows, glinting off the dull metal of old blades. A patient entering such a room might feel both comforted and anxious. Comforted by the signs of learning and preparation, but anxious at the sight of the unknown. For many, the doctor represented both hope and risk, and the contents of his kit were symbols of that uneasy balance. Despite the crude nature of many tools, doctors took pride in their craft. They polished their instruments, sharpened their blades, and kept careful records of which remedies worked best. A well-worn lancet was a badge of experience. A thick recipe book stained with ink and herbs spoke to long nights spent experimenting and revising. Some doctors even added their own inventions to the traditional toolkit, new tinctures, surgical methods, or ways of storing medicines. Innovation was slow, but it existed, sparked by necessity and the occasional flash of inspiration. It's important to understand that the tools of a medieval doctor were not just physical objects, but part of a larger worldview. Each item reflected an understanding of the body that was holistic, symbolic, and deeply tied to nature and the divine. The doctor was not merely a technician, but a mediator between the seen and unseen, the known and mysterious. His tools were bridges, however fragile, between life and loss, health and decline. Traveling from village to village, or serving the same community for decades, the doctor relied on his kit as both a literal and metaphorical anchor. With every patient he visited, he opened his case, drew out a tool, and made a choice, sometimes right, sometimes wrong, but always rooted in a sincere desire to help. These tools, simple as they were, carried enormous weight. They held not just remedies, but the trust of those who believed in him, the traditions of those who trained him, and the hope that healing, however limited, was still possible. Before the medieval doctor ever reached for a jar of herbs or a sharp-edged lancet, before he unrolled his worn scrolls or consulted his moon phase chart, he had to understand one thing above all else: the patient. In a world where knowledge was fragmented and illness was shrouded in mystery, the relationship between healer and sufferer was the heart of every medical encounter. To treat a person in the Middle Ages was to step into their world, one shaped not only by biology but by belief, emotion, family, and fear. Understanding the patient meant understanding everything they believed about life, sickness, and the invisible forces they thought guided both. The average medieval person lived a life deeply connected to the rhythms of nature and the teachings of the Church. Daily life was physical and rooted in the seasons. People planted, harvested, fetched water, and walked long distances. They relied on their bodies to survive, which made any disruption, a pain in the chest, a swollen joint, a fever that wouldn't break, not just uncomfortable but threatening. Illness wasn't a side inconvenience. It could unravel the delicate balance of survival. Yet despite the risks, most people viewed sickness through a lens very different from today's understanding. For them, disease wasn't caused by invisible germs or chemical imbalances but by the will of God, the influence of spirits, or the mysterious imbalance of humors within their body. When a medieval patient became ill, the first step wasn't always calling the doctor. In fact, many people turned first to prayer, home remedies, or the wisdom of older relatives. Women in the household, especially mothers and grandmothers, were often the front line of care. They had their own knowledge passed down over generations: herbs that soothed sore throats, compresses that cooled fevered skin, teas that quieted stomachs. These remedies were sometimes surprisingly effective, and doctors themselves often learned from the households they visited. But when these efforts failed, or when symptoms worsened, a more formal intervention was needed. That's when word would go out for the doctor. For patients in towns, a doctor might have a nearby practice or be found at the local apothecary or infirmary. In rural areas, the situation was more complicated. A doctor might live several villages away, and someone would need to travel, sometimes on foot, to request his presence. This meant that by the time the doctor arrived, the illness might be well advanced. The patient might already be surrounded by worried family, candles burning low, the scent of herbs or incense drifting in the air, and perhaps a priest had come by to offer comfort or blessings. The room would be quiet but tense, eyes turning toward the physician as if he were both scholar and savior. When the doctor entered a patient's home, he entered a space charged with emotion. The walls of a medieval cottage or townhouse were often dark, the air cool and heavy. The sickbed might be made of straw or stuffed with rags, and the patient covered in rough linens. Light came from narrow windows or flickering candles. In these conditions, every movement mattered. The doctor's calm manner, his careful questions, and even the way he set down his bag could affect how much the patient and family trusted him. He would greet the household, often with a formal blessing or kind words, and begin his examination. This examination began not with machines or screens but with the senses. The doctor would look, touch, listen, and sometimes smell. He would observe the color of the patient's skin, check their temperature with the back of his hand, feel for pulses in the wrist or neck. He would ask about dreams, moods, changes in appetite, and other signs. In many cases, he would request a sample of urine and inspect it visually. If the patient could speak, the doctor would listen closely to every description of discomfort or sensation. If the patient couldn't speak, the doctor would rely on the accounts of family members and the visible signs of distress. What's striking is how often the doctor's role extended beyond the body. Many believed that disease could be a symptom of spiritual distress or even divine punishment. This meant the physician might discuss recent events in the patient's life, conflicts, unspoken guilt, broken relationships, or missed prayers. In some cases, he might consult a horoscope or look to the stars to determine whether the timing was right for healing. The boundaries between medical and spiritual care were fluid. A good doctor didn't just treat the body. he treated the soul, or at least, he was expected to. Doctors had to walk a delicate line in how they spoke to patients and families. Too much optimism could lead to disappointment. Too little hope could spread panic. The doctor had to express care without making promises, to acknowledge pain without surrendering to it. He might say that the illness was serious but not beyond help, or that the patient's fate rested in God's hands but that treatment could support healing. This kind of communication, built on tone and presence more than science, was central to the patient experience. The medieval doctor's voice was often as important as his medicine. Once treatment began, the patient had to endure more than just the illness. Remedies could be strange, bitter, or physically unpleasant. A purgative might cause hours of discomfort. Bloodletting could leave a person weak or dizzy. Herbal compresses might stain the skin or emit pungent odors. Even something as simple as bed rest could be difficult in small, crowded homes where quiet was rare. Patients had to trust that these treatments, however uncomfortable, were leading them back to balance. And often they did improve, if only because the body began to recover on its own. But when they didn't, or when illness worsened, the patient's suffering became something shared by everyone in the room. In wealthier households, patients sometimes fared better. They had access to cleaner bedding, better food, warmer fires, and more space. Doctors might be paid more handsomely to visit regularly and stay longer. Some even hired private physicians or invited monks from nearby monasteries to lend support. But illness still came with risks, and no amount of coin could guarantee a cure. The reality was that the medical knowledge of the time had limits. Many conditions, internal bleeding, organ failure, infections, had no real solutions. In these cases, the doctor's presence was symbolic as much as practical. He could offer comfort, dignity, and ritual, even if he couldn't stop the inevitable. Patients in hospitals, when available, faced a different kind of experience. Medieval hospitals were often run by religious orders and focused on care rather than cure. They offered beds, meals, and prayer, but not always advanced medical treatment. Doctors might visit to oversee cases, but much of the daily work was done by monks, nuns, or lay caregivers. In these institutions, the patient's spiritual health was emphasized alongside physical comfort. Prayers were said daily, and confessions were encouraged. Illness was a time for reflection and preparation, and recovery, if it came, was seen as a divine gift. In every setting, the patient's experience was shaped by belief. Belief in the doctor's knowledge. Belief in the healing power of herbs, stars, and faith. Belief in the idea that illness had meaning, even if that meaning was unclear. The patient had to surrender control, to trust in others, and to endure uncertainty without the tools of modern medicine. There were no scans, no antibiotics, no blood tests. Only time, observation, and hope. Doctors themselves had to carry this burden. They knew that not every treatment would work. They understood the limits of their tools and theories. But they still returned to the sickbed, again and again, offering what they could. And for many patients, that offering was enough. The presence of someone who listened, who tried, and who cared, even imperfectly, was a kind of medicine in itself. Over time, some patients recovered and sang the doctor's praises. Others did not, and their families might seek answers in prayer or blame. A doctor's reputation rose and fell with the outcomes of his cases, which were often out of his hands. Yet he continued, moving from home to home, carrying with him not only remedies but a kind of quiet courage. The patient's world was never easy, but the doctor's visit, no matter the result, was always a sign that they were not facing illness alone. In the world of medieval medicine, healing was never just about the body. The heart, mind, and spirit were all seen as deeply entwined, their conditions influencing one another in ways that could not be separated. A fever could be triggered by grief. A persistent cough might be a reflection of sorrow. Anxiety, nightmares, and confusion were often interpreted as signs of spiritual imbalance, divine warning, or even otherworldly interference. As a result, a medieval doctor was not merely a healer of wounds or a mixer of herbs. He was also a counselor, a spiritual guide, and sometimes even a detective, tasked with understanding not only what ailed the flesh but also what burdened the soul. Medieval Europe was a deeply religious place, and Christianity influenced every aspect of life, including health. The Church taught that illness could be a form of divine punishment for sin or a test of one's faith. Many people believed that suffering on earth had a purpose. It might be a means of purification, a pathway to spiritual growth, or a sign that one needed to make peace with God. These beliefs shaped how doctors approached their patients. While they carried tools and herbs for physical ailments, they also carried prayers, blessings, and advice rooted in scripture or religious tradition. Some doctors were clerics themselves, trained in both medicine and theology. Others worked closely with priests and monks, especially when a case seemed to reach beyond the physical. When a patient displayed signs of mental distress, sadness that would not lift, fear without cause, visions or voices others could not see, it was a moment that called for extra care. There was no concept of mental health in the way we understand it today. Instead, such symptoms were interpreted through the lens of humors and spirits. Melancholy, for example, was thought to be caused by an excess of black bile, leading to gloominess and despair. A person who wept frequently, avoided company, or spoke in riddles might be diagnosed with a melancholic temperament. The treatment for such a condition could include a specific diet, warm baths scented with calming herbs, and rest in a peaceful setting, ideally near water, trees, or within the quiet walls of a monastery. In more serious cases, the doctor might suspect demonic possession or divine punishment. Though not all physicians believed in supernatural causes for illness, many lived in communities that did. If a person became violent or irrational, or if their behavior defied all expected patterns, it might be said they were touched by an evil force. In such cases, the doctor would not act alone. A priest would be called to perform prayers or even an exorcism. The doctor, for his part, might administer sedatives made from poppy, valerian, or lettuce, or use rituals meant to calm the patient's spirit. He would also observe and record, noting whether symptoms worsened at night, during storms, or near certain individuals, all believed by some to be signs of supernatural involvement. But not every mind-based illness was met with fear. Many doctors took a thoughtful, measured approach. They recognized that grief could sicken the body and that loneliness could lead to real, physical pain. Patients who had lost loved ones or suffered great misfortune were often treated with as much seriousness as those with broken bones. The doctor might recommend periods of solitude balanced with structured company. He might encourage walks, storytelling, music, or simple crafts. Healing the mind, in his view, required stability and slowness, a return to balance not only in the humors but in the heart. While his tools were few, his empathy could be profound. Hospitals and monasteries played a major role in this kind of care. Within the sheltered walls of these places, patients suffering from both physical and emotional ailments were often given rest, spiritual instruction, and a quiet routine. The goal was not just to treat symptoms but to restore peace. Nuns and monks read aloud from sacred texts, prepared gentle meals, and led prayers. For many, just being in a space of safety and structure helped soothe the mind. Doctors who visited such places sometimes noted remarkable improvements in patients once they were removed from the noise and stress of daily life. The simplicity of the surroundings, the rhythm of the days, and the presence of others who cared, these were powerful remedies in their own right. Even outside of institutions, spiritual treatment played a role in daily medical life. Doctors might carry small relics or tokens they believed had protective power. They sometimes wore rings or medallions engraved with prayers, or hung charms above patients' beds. These weren't just decorations, they were active parts of the healing process. Some believed that reading from a holy book while preparing a medicine could make it more effective, or that grinding herbs while reciting a psalm brought blessings into the mix. To the medieval mind, the boundary between the physical and spiritual was thin, and a good doctor respected both sides. Astrology also entered the picture. The stars and planets were believed to influence personality, mood, and health. A doctor treating emotional or mental distress might consult a star chart before prescribing a remedy. Certain planetary alignments were thought to encourage sadness, agitation, or clarity. The moon's phase, in particular, was said to affect the brain and emotions. Lunar madness, a term still whispered in some circles, was thought to rise with the full moon. While this may seem far-fetched today, it was part of a larger belief system that tried to find order in the unpredictable workings of the mind. Dreams, too, held meaning. Patients who had disturbing or unusual dreams often shared them with their doctor, who might try to interpret them based on known symbols or religious stories. A dream of water could mean cleansing or drowning. A dream of fire might signal anger, infection, or divine warning. The doctor's role in these moments was to listen without judgment, to gently ask questions, and to look for signs of emotional distress. If he believed the dream reflected inner turmoil, he might prescribe time in nature, soft music, or more time in prayer. The goal was always to calm the inner storm and guide the patient back to peace. There were also community healers who focused almost entirely on spiritual and emotional care. These were often wise women, midwives, or herbalists who lacked formal training but carried deep knowledge of plants, rituals, and the human heart. Doctors sometimes worked alongside them, recognizing their unique insights. While tensions could arise, especially if the church disapproved, many physicians knew that healing came in many forms. A whispered blessing, a soothing voice, a hand placed gently on a fevered brow, these things could not be measured, but they mattered deeply to the patient. Of course, not all mental or emotional suffering ended in recovery. Some people lived with chronic sadness, agitation, or disorientation for years. In such cases, families often bore the weight of care. Some communities offered sanctuary, others responded with fear. A doctor might visit occasionally, but often there was little he could do. Still, many tried. They brought calming herbs, prayed over their patients, and spoke kind words in dark hours. Even when healing was impossible, compassion remained. The idea that emotions could affect the body wasn't just a medieval belief, it was an observed reality. Doctors noted that people who laughed often healed faster. Those surrounded by supportive family tended to survive longer illnesses. Patients who lost hope seemed to fade more quickly. These observations led some physicians to emphasize the importance of peace, friendship, and forgiveness. They encouraged patients to make amends, to release burdens, and to speak honestly. In this way, medicine became a kind of soul work, an effort not just to fix, but to uplift. As centuries passed, some doctors began to record their experiences with emotional illness more carefully. Case studies appeared in their journals: a man cured of sorrow through music, a woman's visions eased by time in nature, a child calmed by herbs and storytelling. These notes, humble as they were, marked the slow beginnings of a deeper understanding that the mind was its own realm, as real and complex as the body. And though their tools were limited, medieval doctors treated it with the seriousness it deserved. To be a doctor in the Middle Ages was to be part healer, part listener, part believer. You didn't just stitch wounds or drain fluids. You watched for signs in the stars, interpreted dreams, read faces for hidden grief, and honored the quiet power of kindness. You knew that behind every fever or tremor was a story, one filled with hopes, fears, faith, and longing. And while you couldn't always provide a cure, you could always offer presence, patience, and peace. There are moments in history when the role of a doctor becomes not just important but essential, even heroic. In medieval Europe, one such moment loomed over all others like a dark cloud, silent at first, then suffocating. When the plague came, it did not tap gently at the door. It crashed through, changing everything. For a medieval doctor, the arrival of the Black Death, also called the Great Pestilence, meant facing the limits of their knowledge, the collapse of trust in institutions, and the terrifying reality of treating a disease they could not understand, contain, or cure. And yet many stayed. Many tried. Many walked into the eye of the storm, sat beside the dying, and did what they could. This chapter is about what it meant to be a doctor in the face of one of the deadliest epidemics the world has ever known. The plague arrived in Europe in the 14th century, but signs of its approach were noticed even earlier. Rumors came from the east, of cities emptied, trade routes abandoned, and entire caravans silenced. When the disease reached European ports, it spread rapidly, carried by fleas that lived on rats, which in turn traveled on ships and carts. But medieval people did not understand the role of bacteria, fleas, or rodents. To them, the plague seemed to arrive with the wind, or to follow in the wake of bad omens, strange weather, falling stars, or eclipses. Some believed it was punishment from God, others blamed poisoned wells or the alignment of planets. What mattered most was not how it came, but how quickly it consumed. A medieval doctor responding to the outbreak would have found himself overwhelmed from the start. The symptoms were shocking: sudden fever, chills, swelling in the lymph nodes, especially in the armpits, neck, or groin, followed by dark blotches on the skin and unbearable pain. In many cases, death followed within days. Some people collapsed in the streets, others perished alone in their homes. Entire households could be wiped out in a matter of days. Communities that once bustled with daily life turned into ghost towns, with shuttered windows, deserted markets, and the sound of bells tolling constantly in mourning. As patients poured in or called for help, doctors had to make difficult choices. Some refused to see patients, fearing for their own lives. Others fled entirely, taking their families and escaping to the countryside. But many stayed, driven by duty, compassion, or faith. Those who remained adapted their practices as best they could. They wore long robes, gloves, and masks, some shaped like birds with long beaks, filled with herbs or vinegar-soaked cloth meant to purify the air. These early attempts at personal protection were based on the belief that the plague was carried by bad air, or miasma. Doctors burned incense, carried flowers, or walked with scented pomander to guard against infection. While these methods did little to stop the disease, they gave doctors and patients alike a sense of control. Treating plague victims was both physically and emotionally exhausting. Doctors might visit dozens of homes each day, stepping over straw soaked with sweat and blood, passing by grieving families, and kneeling beside the dying. They administered herbal concoctions, attempted to lance buboes to drain the swelling, and applied poultices made of onion, butter, or even crushed emeralds. They prescribed prayers, fasting, and isolation. In some cases, they advised patients to move away from crowded areas or to purify their homes with fire and vinegar. But none of it worked with consistency. For every one patient who survived, many more did not. One of the greatest challenges for doctors was the speed of the disease. Illnesses that might have developed over weeks or months in other times now unfolded in hours. A patient who seemed stable in the morning might be gone by nightfall. This gave little time to observe, experiment, or adjust treatment. Doctors often recorded symptoms feverishly, hoping to identify a pattern, a clue, anything that might offer a path forward. These notes, scribbled in the margins of old texts or kept in personal journals, form some of our earliest written records of epidemic medicine. They are filled with fear, sorrow, and determination. Hospitals, such as they were, quickly filled beyond capacity. Monasteries tried to help, but many monks and nuns succumbed themselves. Makeshift infirmaries were set up in barns, churches, and empty halls. Doctors moved among them like shadows, quiet, focused, their hands raw from washing in vinegar, their robes stained with the marks of 100 households. Some began to lose hope. Others leaned harder into their faith, believing that their work, however futile it seemed, had spiritual value. They saw themselves not just as healers, but as companions in suffering, witnesses to the final moments of those who would otherwise die alone. In the middle of the storm, the doctor also had to manage fear, not just their own, but the fear of the people. Panic spread faster than the disease. Some towns closed their gates to outsiders. Others blamed foreigners or outcasts. Doctors were sometimes caught in the middle, accused of failing to stop the plague, or of spreading it themselves. It was not uncommon for a doctor to be threatened, driven out, or begged for help with equal desperation. Their status as healers made them both revered and feared. To wear the doctor's robe during the plague was to wear a target, a hope, and a heavy burden. The tools doctors relied on were the same as before: lancets, urinals, herbal mixtures, but their use became more desperate. Some experimented wildly, combining new herbs or treatments without precedent. Others turned entirely to prayer and ritual. Some believed that sound could drive the disease away and encouraged the ringing of bells or singing of hymns in the streets. Public processions were held, and some doctors recommended walking in circles of prayer around infected areas. Nothing was too unusual to try, because nothing seemed to work. Among the most harrowing aspects of plague medicine was dealing with the dead. Doctors had to confirm death, advise on burial, and sometimes help with moving bodies. Graves were dug in haste, sometimes in mass numbers. The stench of decay filled the air, and doctors began wearing masks not just to guard against illness but to avoid the unbearable smell. This contact with death, repeated day after day, took its toll. Some doctors broke under the pressure. Others became numb. A few found unexpected strength and calm in the midst of it all, focused solely on the tasks before them. Not all patients died. Some survived, either because they had a milder form of the illness or because of natural resistance. These recoveries became beacons of hope. Doctors studied them carefully, searching for common traits or treatments that might be repeated. A handful of doctors began to advise cleanliness, fresh air, and simple diets as preventative measures, ideas that would later prove useful. Some began to isolate themselves after each visit, removing their clothing, washing thoroughly, and avoiding their families. These early efforts at quarantine were crude but instinctively wise. After the worst waves of the plague passed, the doctors' roles shifted again. Now, they were not just healers but survivors. They were the ones who remembered the names of the lost, who held the last words of patients in their memories, who tried to rebuild their practices in shattered towns. Some wrote books or shared their experiences with others. Others left medicine entirely, too burdened by what they had seen. But many remained, changed forever, their identities bound to the memory of a time when medicine had failed more often than it had succeeded, but where compassion had never been in short supply. The plague taught medieval doctors hard lessons. It revealed the limits of tradition and the dangers of ignorance. It exposed the fragility of communities and the power of fear. But it also showed the strength of those who stayed. In an era with no vaccines, no antibiotics, and no understanding of microscopic life, the doctor faced an invisible enemy with only the tools of observation, care, and courage. And though they could not stop the tide, they held the hands of those swept away by it, giving them dignity, presence, and one last connection to the world they were leaving. Every medieval doctor, no matter how respected or accomplished, knew his work would not live on unless someone learned to carry it forward. The medical knowledge of the Middle Ages was not written into standardized textbooks or sealed behind the doors of great institutions. It lived in the minds and hands of those who practiced it, passed from teacher to student through whispered explanations, careful demonstrations, and long hours spent by candlelight. To be an apprentice to a medieval doctor was to enter a world of mystery and discipline, where each lesson might begin with an herb and end with a prayer. It was a long road, filled with strange experiences and endless curiosity, and only a few ever reached its end. The journey of an apprentice typically began at a young age. Boys, rarely girls, though some would learn healing through family tradition, might be sent to study under a physician when they were just entering adolescence. Their families, often proud and hopeful, saw medicine as a noble path, one that offered stability, education, and the chance to serve others. If the doctor agreed to take them on, the apprentice would leave home and move into his master's house or workspace, becoming not just a student but a helper, assistant, and companion. In time, the apprentice would learn the names and uses of dozens of herbs, memorize the principles of humoral theory, and eventually take on patients of their own, always under the watchful eye of their teacher. In the beginning, the tasks were simple. The apprentice swept the floor, boiled water, ground dried roots, and cleaned tools. These chores were not meaningless. They taught patience, attention to detail, and respect for the work. While preparing remedies or organizing supplies, the apprentice might overhear his master explaining a diagnosis, negotiating with a patient's family, or experimenting with a new treatment. Listening became a vital part of learning, and so did asking questions, though always at the right time. Doctors did not always welcome interruption, especially during moments of concentration. A smart apprentice learned to observe first, speak second, and absorb everything he could without needing to be told twice. As trust grew, so did responsibility. The apprentice began to assist during visits, carrying the physician's satchel, taking notes, and eventually applying simple treatments. He might be asked to gather ingredients from a nearby field or forest, relying on knowledge of the local terrain and the changing seasons. He might be sent to retrieve a urine sample from a nervous family, or to deliver a completed remedy to a house across town. In these moments, the apprentice was expected to act with dignity and care, representing his master's reputation. A careless mistake could reflect badly on both of them. One of the most important lessons the apprentice learned was how to observe the human body. Without modern instruments, diagnosis depended on the eyes, ears, hands, and memory. The apprentice learned to recognize different types of rashes, swelling, and discoloration. He studied the ways people described pain, their expressions, their posture, their tone of voice. He learned to feel for a pulse, to recognize heat or chill in the skin, and to assess the clarity and color of urine. Every patient became a new opportunity to practice, refine, and remember. At night, the apprentice might copy notes into his own journal, adding drawings or symbols to help him remember key cases. Reading and writing were critical skills. Since many medical texts were in Latin, the apprentice had to become fluent, not only in reading the language but in understanding the style of writing used in medical manuscripts. Some doctors taught their students how to copy texts by hand, preserving knowledge for future generations. Others allowed apprentices to study their personal libraries, giving access to rare works by Galen, Avicenna, or Hippocrates. These ancient authors formed the backbone of medieval medical theory, and a serious apprentice might spend years trying to understand their methods and teachings. Sometimes, the apprentice was invited to observe surgeries or more invasive procedures. These were difficult lessons, both physically and emotionally. A tooth extraction might involve restraining the patient, while the doctor worked with iron forceps. A cauterization required a hot iron, steady hands, and the courage to act in the face of a patient's screams. The apprentice might be tasked with handing tools, applying salves, or keeping the patient still. It was not a place for the faint-hearted, but for those with steady nerves and compassion. The more the apprentice proved himself, the more he was allowed to do. Apprenticeship also included the study of medicines and their preparation. Herbs had to be gathered at the right time, some at dawn, others at dusk, some only during certain lunar phases. Leaves, roots, flowers, and bark were dried, crushed, boiled, or steeped according to the recipe. The apprentice learned the difference between a tincture and a poultice, between a decoction and an infusion. He learned to measure by eye and by touch, since scales were rare and inconsistent. He also learned the dangers of incorrect preparation, how too much of one herb could worsen a condition, or how two ingredients might cancel each other's effects. These lessons often came with stories of past mistakes, warnings spoken quietly but firmly. A good master didn't just teach techniques. He taught how to think. He asked questions that had no easy answers. What do you do when a fever doesn't break? How do you speak to a patient who's afraid? When do you stop treating and simply comfort? These conversations were as important as any herbal mixture. They taught the apprentice that being a doctor meant making decisions, not just based on books or habits, but on each patient's unique story. It meant using judgment, humility, and empathy in equal measure. The relationship between master and apprentice was complex. It could be warm and encouraging, or distant and formal, depending on the personalities involved. Some masters treated their apprentices like sons, sharing meals, family events, and private thoughts. Others remained strictly professional, expecting obedience and discipline above all. But in either case, the bond between them was strong. They faced long days together, sickness and recovery, failure and hope. Over time, they came to understand each other's rhythms, the unspoken signals, the preferred methods, the shared goals. Eventually, the apprentice would reach a turning point. His master might allow him to see patients on his own, to prepare treatments without supervision, or even to speak during consultations. These moments were tests, quiet but powerful. The apprentice had to show that he could carry the weight of responsibility, that he could think for himself, and that he had earned the trust placed in him. If he succeeded, he might be recommended to a local guild, a university, or a patron who would support his independent practice. If he failed, he might be sent back to observe longer, to refine his skills and prove himself again. For some apprentices, the journey ended with formal recognition, a certificate, a blessing, or a ceremony acknowledging their readiness. Others simply began working on their own, gradually building their reputation through word of mouth. A few stayed with their masters, becoming partners or successors. The transition from apprentice to doctor was not always marked by a single moment, but by a slow accumulation of trust, knowledge, and confidence. The tradition of apprenticeship ensured that medical knowledge was not lost during times of crisis or change. When a master grew old or ill, his apprentice often stepped in to carry on the work. In this way, practices remained rooted in the community, and patients continued to receive care. The tools, recipes, and wisdom of one generation passed quietly into the hands of the next. And while new ideas occasionally emerged, from distant lands, from university scholars, from travelers and explorers, the core of medieval medicine remained anchored in this personal, patient form of teaching. It was not a perfect system. Apprenticeship depended heavily on the skill and character of the master. A careless teacher might produce a careless doctor. A narrow-minded one might discourage curiosity. But at its best, apprenticeship created doctors who were not only knowledgeable but wise, men who understood suffering, who respected life, and who carried with them the voices of every patient they had ever known. In every village and town, you could find the echo of these apprenticeships. In the way a doctor mixed his herbs, in the stories he told about distant teachers, in the way he held a patient's hand or spoke gently during moments of fear. These were the marks of someone who had learned by doing, by watching, by listening. And while his robes might fade, and his tools wear thin, the legacy of his learning would live on, not just in books or buildings, but in the quiet acts of care passed from one healer to the next. If one were to follow the thread of medieval medicine back through time, past the bustle of market towns and university lecture halls, it would eventually lead to the thick stone walls of a monastery. Hidden behind tall hedgerows, iron gates, and rows of planted herbs, monasteries served not only as places of prayer and devotion but also as centers of healing. In an age when hospitals were scarce, medical schools still forming, and formal doctors hard to find outside cities, it was often the monks and nuns who took on the responsibility of tending to the sick. Their work combined faith and care, scripture and science, silence and service. And for many medieval doctors, the foundations of their knowledge and practice were laid within these sacred spaces. Monasteries functioned as self-contained communities, where daily life followed a structured rhythm guided by bells, prayer, and hard work. The residents devoted themselves to spiritual reflection, physical labor, and acts of service. Among their many duties, caring for the sick was considered a holy obligation, a form of charity that reflected the teachings of compassion found in their scriptures. Monks and nuns who performed this duty were not always formally trained in medicine, but many became skilled through experience, observation, and access to rare books. The monastery's libraries often contained ancient texts, some copied by hand over generations, that preserved medical writings from Greece, Rome, and the Islamic world. These sacred healing spaces, often referred to as infirmaries, were usually attached to the main monastic building or set apart in a quiet wing. The rooms were simple but thoughtfully arranged, with low wooden beds, clean linens, and windows that let in light and fresh air. There might be a small altar nearby, a shelf of herbs, and a pot of warm broth simmering over a fire. It was a setting designed to calm, not to alarm, a sharp contrast to the more hurried and chaotic care available in overcrowded towns. Ailing monks, weary travelers, and local villagers alike could find comfort here, sometimes without payment, as part of the monastery's charitable mission. Doctors in the secular world often admired the monastery's dedication to healing. Many traveled to learn from the monks, to read their collections, or to collaborate in times of great need. A young apprentice might be sent to observe the work of the monastic caregivers, or a village doctor might refer a complicated case to the infirmary's care. Monks who specialized in healing, sometimes called infirmarians, became known for their calm demeanor, thoughtful observation, and deep understanding of medicinal plants. Their treatments were rooted in humility, prayer, and a belief that the body and soul must be treated together. One of the great strengths of monastic medicine was its herbal knowledge. Monks maintained extensive gardens filled with healing plants: lavender, mint, sage, yarrow, comfrey, and more, each grown with care and harvested according to tradition. Some monasteries kept detailed records of their herbal remedies, noting the effects of different mixtures and the best times for planting and gathering. These gardens were both practical and spiritual. Tending them was seen as an act of devotion, and the growth of each plant a reminder of life's cycle and God's providence. For doctors who lacked access to large estates or diverse flora, these monastic resources were invaluable. Herbal remedies were prepared with great care. Roots were dried in shaded lofts, leaves crushed with wooden mortars, and salves mixed over gentle flames. Honey, vinegar, and oil served as bases for infusions and ointments. Monks and nuns took pride in the purity of their work. Cleanliness, both physical and spiritual, was considered essential. Tools were washed after use, hands were scrubbed with lye soap, and prayer often accompanied the preparation of each medicine. These acts were not viewed as superstition, but as an integration of healing and holiness. Medical texts held within monastery walls were another source of wisdom. Works by Hippocrates and Galen sat beside writings by Avicenna and Hildegard of Bingen. These manuscripts, often bound in leather and written in Latin, contained diagrams of the human body, lists of symptoms and treatments, and philosophical discussions about health and balance. Monks copied them by hand, sometimes over the course of years, preserving knowledge that might otherwise have been lost. Illuminated with colorful inks and careful script, these books were as beautiful as they were practical. A visiting doctor might be allowed to read one under supervision, copying a section to take home and study further. The approach to healing in monasteries was often gentler than that of urban physicians. Where a city doctor might rely on leeches or bloodletting, the monastic caregiver might prescribe rest, prayer, and herbal teas. There was a deep awareness of the body's natural rhythms and a belief that forcing too much could do more harm than good. Patients were encouraged to eat simple, nourishing foods, to sleep in peace, and to focus on reflection and forgiveness. Spiritual health was seen as vital to physical recovery, and confession, prayer, and guidance from a spiritual elder were common parts of the treatment process. Yet, monasteries were not isolated from the outside world. When plagues or illnesses swept through the land, monks and nuns tended to the sick at great personal risk. Their infirmaries became crowded, their routines disrupted, and their numbers diminished by infection. Still, they remained at their posts. Their devotion to healing, even in the face of danger, inspired many, including secular doctors, who saw their resilience as a model of courage and service. Stories of monks who spent their final days comforting the dying became part of the local lore, told again and again with reverence. The relationship between medieval doctors and monasteries wasn't always smooth. At times, there were disagreements over methods, interpretations of illness, or the role of divine intervention. Doctors trained in universities sometimes looked down on monastic healers as old-fashioned or overly mystical. Monks, in turn, might view city doctors as prideful or too quick to act without reflection. Yet despite these tensions, both groups understood that their goals were the same: to reduce suffering, to bring comfort, and to restore health when possible. Some doctors chose to join monastic communities themselves, bringing their knowledge into the cloister and devoting their lives to quiet healing. These physician monks became important bridges between different worlds, preserving scientific knowledge while grounding their work in spiritual discipline. Others chose to collaborate from the outside, forming friendships and exchanging letters with those behind the monastery walls. In both cases, the lines between medicine and ministry often blurred. For patients, the monastery represented a place of hope. When no one else could help, when fear or poverty closed other doors, the monastery remained open. A weary traveler might be offered food and rest before being seen by the infirmarian. A sick child might receive a poultice and a prayer. An elderly widow might be given a bed for the night, a bowl of broth, and a hymn sung softly in the next room. These simple acts of care left deep impressions, acts that often went unrecorded but shaped the lives of those who received them. In the broader story of medieval medicine, monasteries played a quiet but crucial role. They kept knowledge alive during times of upheaval. They treated the sick when others could not. They taught patience, observation, and humility. And they reminded every doctor, from the bustling streets of the city to the farthest rural village, that healing was not just about cures. It was about presence, kindness, and faith. The stone walls may have seemed silent, but within them, the work of healing echoed across centuries, shaping generations of doctors who would carry that sacred mission forward. In the modern world, a trip to the doctor often involves machines that scan, beep, and flash. A thermometer gives an exact number, a blood test reveals invisible data, and complex instruments peek inside the human body without leaving a mark. But for the medieval doctor, none of these tools existed. Diagnosing an illness required nothing more, and nothing less, than a sharp mind, a keen eye, steady hands, and deep patience. In a time when understanding of the body was based on humors and tradition rather than cellular science, diagnosis was both an art and a skill, requiring years of experience and careful observation. To understand what it was like to be a medieval doctor is to step into a world where every clue mattered and every sense was used in the pursuit of healing. The very first step in diagnosing a patient was often the simplest: watching. A medieval doctor would quietly observe a patient as they approached or lay in bed. How they walked, how they breathed, the color of their skin, the sound of their voice, each offered hints. Pale cheeks might suggest blood loss or coldness. A flushed face could indicate heat or fever. Slumped shoulders might reflect exhaustion or sadness. In the absence of tools, the body itself became a living text to be read by those who knew its language. Next came touch. The doctor would place his hands gently on the patient's forehead, cheeks, chest, or limbs. He was not just feeling for warmth or chill, but for texture and tension. Was the skin clammy or dry? Did it feel tight or swollen? Was the pulse strong, weak, irregular? The pulse, in particular, was seen as a vital sign. Medieval doctors often placed great emphasis on pulse readings, though they lacked the modern understanding of heart rhythms or blood pressure. Instead, they described the pulse in poetic terms: soft, bounding, hesitant, fluttering. These descriptions reflected not only what was felt but what was believed to be happening inside the body. The sense of smell played an unexpected role in diagnosis. It might seem odd today, but a doctor would often take note of the scent in the room or even the smell of the patient's breath, sweat, or wounds. Certain odors were associated with specific illnesses or imbalances in the humors. A sour or putrid scent might suggest internal decay or infection. A sweet or overly fragrant smell could be viewed with suspicion as well. Though primitive, this use of smell was sometimes surprisingly effective, especially in identifying infections or fevers before they became visible. Then came the inspection of bodily fluids, with urine taking center stage. The analysis of urine, called uroscopy, was a cornerstone of medieval medical practice. Doctors would ask for a sample and study it in a glass flask, holding it up to the light and examining its color, clarity, thickness, and any floating materials. Charts known as urine wheels or uroscopy guides were consulted, filled with detailed illustrations of urine colors and their supposed meanings. Pale yellow might indicate excess phlegm, deep red too much heat or blood, cloudy or dark urine could mean digestive problems or imbalance in the black bile. Doctors sometimes even smelled or tasted urine to gather more information, believing it revealed truths that could not be seen with the eye alone. Questions followed. The doctor would speak with the patient, asking carefully chosen queries about their recent experiences, emotions, appetite, sleep patterns, dreams, and more. Each answer was interpreted through the lens of humoral theory. Was the patient melancholy, hot-tempered, listless, or agitated? Did they crave certain foods? Had they recently traveled, been frightened, or experienced stress or sadness? The idea was to understand not only the physical symptoms, but the full context of the patient's life. A good doctor listened more than he spoke, taking in the details and quietly comparing them to the teachings of the great medical authors. Of course, diagnosis did not happen in a vacuum. The doctor also considered the time of year, the weather, the phase of the moon, and even the positions of the planets. Astrology played a prominent role in medieval medicine. It was believed that celestial bodies influenced the balance of the humors and the workings of the body. A diagnosis might be delayed until a more favorable planetary alignment, or a treatment altered based on the current astrological sign. Far from superstition, this was considered learned science at the time, and many doctors carried astrological charts with them or consulted experts in the field. For more serious or unclear cases, doctors might consult books or colleagues. The written knowledge of Galen, Avicenna, and Hippocrates was often turned to in moments of uncertainty. These books provided lists of symptoms and their likely causes, arranged according to humoral theory. Some doctors kept personal journals filled with past cases and notes. They might compare a new case to an old one, looking for similarities and differences. Diagnosis was a process of connecting science, patterns, and tradition into a working theory of the patient's condition. Treatment did not always follow immediately after diagnosis. Doctors often believed that the body should be given time to correct itself. They might recommend fasting, rest, gentle movement, or mild herbal teas before more aggressive treatments were applied. If the diagnosis suggested a buildup of one humor, the doctor would seek to remove it. This might involve bloodletting, purging, or sweating. If the issue was thought to be caused by something external, such as bad air or contaminated food, the treatment might focus on cleansing the environment, removing offensive smells, or changing the patient's diet. For example, a patient suffering from chest pain might be diagnosed with a buildup of phlegm in the lungs. The doctor might recommend warm, drying herbs such as thyme or hyssop, a lighter diet free of dairy or cold foods, and steam inhalation with aromatic oils. If the patient also appeared anxious or restless, the diagnosis might include an emotional or spiritual component, and the treatment could expand to include prayer, confession, or calming rituals. Every diagnosis was a combination of science, observation, experience, and belief. One of the challenges of medieval diagnosis was the lack of standardized terminology. What one doctor called heat in the liver, another might describe as excess yellow bile. Symptoms were sometimes vague, and patients could describe their discomfort in metaphors or comparisons. It was the doctor's task to translate those words into action. This made diagnosis as much about communication as it was about knowledge. A successful doctor was not only observant but skilled at interpreting both what was said and what was not. Diagnosis also had legal and ethical implications. In some regions, doctors were required to testify to the cause of death or the nature of a patient's illness, especially in cases involving nobility or suspected foul play. A misdiagnosis could damage a doctor's reputation, while a correct diagnosis could enhance it greatly. Word of mouth spread quickly, and patients often chose their physicians based on personal stories of successful diagnoses and recoveries. Despite the limitations of their time, many medieval doctors were remarkably careful and thorough in their diagnostic process. They took nothing for granted and learned to trust their senses and instincts. Over time, some developed reputations not just as healers but as wise observers of human life. Their ability to recognize the early signs of disease, to comfort the worried, and to explain the mysterious in terms people could understand made them pillars of their communities. It's worth remembering that even when their theories were incorrect, their methods often provided real benefits. The act of listening, of paying close attention, of showing care and presence, these are powerful forces in healing. A patient who felt seen and heard, who trusted their doctor and believed in their treatment, often had a better chance of recovery. And in a world where illness could strike without warning and resources were few, that trust was essential. The absence of machines did not mean the absence of skill. On the contrary, the medieval doctor had to hone his abilities to a fine point, relying entirely on what his body and brain could perceive. Every diagnosis was a challenge, a puzzle made of shadows and signs. And though they lacked microscopes and lab results, their efforts laid the groundwork for future generations. In their careful observations, their long hours beside the sickbed, and their tireless attempts to understand suffering, medieval doctors kept the flame of medical inquiry alive, one patient at a time. Though medieval doctors were most often men, university-trained, robed, and respected in public spheres, the truth is that the healing landscape of the Middle Ages was far broader than the official records reveal. Behind closed doors and beyond the reach of guilds and formal lectures, women played a crucial role in medicine. They may not have held titles like physician or surgeon, but they were the quiet foundation of health and care in many communities. From midwives and herbalists to caretakers and household nurses, women brought healing to the sick, comfort to the suffering, and knowledge passed down through generations. Their work was rarely recorded in the annals of academic history, but it was vital, widespread, and deeply respected by those they helped. In most villages and towns, the first person summoned for an illness was not a doctor but a woman. These women had experience, intuition, and often an inherited understanding of remedies and rituals. Some were known simply as wise women or cunning folk. Others were recognized midwives or caretakers. They had no formal degrees, no coats of arms or seals of approval, but they had something far more important: trust. Generations of mothers had called on them, and their names were known not from books but from stories shared around hearths and doorways. They helped during births, nursed the feverish, treated wounds, prepared the dead, and sometimes even advised on troubled hearts or minds. Midwives were perhaps the most prominent of these women healers. Childbirth was seen as both a natural and spiritual event, one fraught with danger, especially in a time before antiseptics or surgical techniques. Midwives brought with them towels, herbal infusions, swaddling cloths, and years of hands-on experience. They knew how to turn a breech baby, calm a panicked mother, and care for the newborn in those fragile first hours. They also offered spiritual guidance, whispering prayers or psalms during delivery. In many communities, a midwife was second only to the priest in importance. Yet despite their skill, they were rarely given formal recognition by the medical community. In some areas, they needed a license from the church. In others, they practiced independently, relying on their reputation and results to protect their place in society. Many women also served as herbalists, cultivating gardens filled with healing plants and preparing remedies for everything from headaches to stomach troubles. These remedies were often shared freely or traded, and their recipes were guarded with care. A village woman might know the exact mix of chamomile, mint, and honey to settle an upset stomach, or how to brew comfort to help heal a broken bone. Her knowledge came from her mother, who learned it from her mother, and so on. These women were doctors in every sense but name, and their home gardens were pharmacies in their own right. In wealthier homes, women often acted as caretakers, watching over ill family members, preparing meals and herbal mixtures, and managing cleanliness and comfort. While their efforts were expected and often invisible to outsiders, they played a crucial role in the healing process. A doctor might visit once a day, or less, but the female caretaker remained by the patient's side hour after hour, noting every change, adjusting treatments, and offering constant reassurance. These women learned to read signs in the body just as well as any trained man, and many developed a sense of timing and instinct that allowed them to act when others hesitated. Despite their contributions, women in medicine faced many challenges. Laws and customs often restricted their ability to work publicly or claim authority. In cities with formal medical guilds, women were usually excluded or had to practice in secret. Universities did not admit them, and their writings, if they managed to record their knowledge at all, were often lost or ignored. In some periods, suspicion of women healers grew, especially if their remedies succeeded where others had failed. Some were accused of witchcraft or consorting with spirits, their knowledge misunderstood and feared. These accusations could be deadly, though many communities defended their healers fiercely, refusing to let suspicion erase generations of care. Even within the church, where women held some influence as nuns and caregivers, medical knowledge was carefully controlled. Convents often housed skilled healers who tended to the sick and preserved herbal knowledge. Some wrote down their observations and shared them with trusted physicians. One of the most famous examples is Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th-century abbess whose writings on medicine, botany, and the human body influenced scholars for centuries. Her work bridged the gap between science and spirituality, offering remedies that combined herbs, prayers, and thoughtful reflection. But even she was exceptional, and many of her female peers remained unnamed. Occasionally, women were recognized in more formal ways. In a few cities, particularly in parts of Italy and southern France, women received licenses to practice medicine, often as midwives or specialists in female health. These licenses required approval from local authorities and sometimes from the church. In rare cases, women trained with physicians, often family members, and gained enough respect to practice more broadly. Some became known across regions for their skill, attracting patients from distant towns. These women operated with a blend of caution and confidence, balancing the demands of tradition with the quiet strength of experience. Doctors, too, were often aware of women's contributions. Many consulted local herbalists or midwives when dealing with complex cases. They respected their instincts and relied on their deep familiarity with local people and conditions. Though some were dismissive or skeptical, others saw women healers as allies in the shared work of easing suffering. Letters, journals, and surviving case notes occasionally mention the advice of a village midwife or the skill of a convent nurse. These traces remind us that medicine, even in its most official form, was never practiced alone. The female medical tradition was not just about herbs and home remedies. It was about presence. Women stayed with the sick when others left. They tended to the vulnerable, the poor, the dying. They sang lullabies to the fevered child, whispered encouragement to the frightened mother, and prepared simple food for the man too weak to eat. Their medicine was wrapped in patience and warmth. It involved clean sheets, fresh water, and quiet companionship. In this way, healing became not only a science but a form of love, a daily, determined act of care in a world that often felt uncertain. Women also passed on their knowledge carefully, choosing younger relatives or trusted neighbors to inherit their recipes and methods. These apprenticeships were informal but meaningful, ensuring that remedies were not forgotten and that communities remained cared for. A girl who watched her grandmother crush herbs or mix salves might one day do the same for her own children. In this way, women's medicine endured, quiet, resilient, and deeply rooted. In the end, the story of medieval medicine is incomplete without these women. They worked in the margins but left an imprint on every corner of society. They bridged the gap between illness and comfort, between tradition and innovation. Though they were rarely named in university halls or royal records, they were remembered in the hearts of those they helped. They were the ones who came when no one else would, who stayed long after others had gone, who offered both remedy and reassurance in the same gentle hand. To be a medieval doctor was a challenge, but to be a woman practicing medicine during that time was a quiet act of strength. And though history may have tried to overlook them, their work carried through the centuries, whispered from one generation to the next, alive in gardens, kitchens, and healing hands everywhere. Not every medieval doctor stayed in one place. While some were tied to towns, monasteries, or noble households, many others lived and worked as travelers. These itinerant doctors, sometimes known as wandering healers or physicians on the road, moved from village to village, castle to castle, and market to market. Carrying their knowledge, tools, and reputation in a worn satchel, they crossed rivers, hills, and borders in search of patients who needed them. Some were well-respected medical professionals trained at universities or by masters. Others were self-taught or passed down wisdom from relatives. Some were skilled, others questionable. But all played a vital role in delivering care where no permanent physician could be found. In rural areas, especially across the vast stretches of medieval Europe where towns were sparse and roads were rough, access to consistent medical care was limited. A small village might go years without seeing a formally trained doctor. Instead, when illness struck or accidents occurred, villagers relied on whoever could be summoned, or on a traveling healer who passed through just often enough to be remembered. These doctors were welcomed as both visitors and lifelines. Their arrival might be announced with a knock at the gates or a quiet word from a traveling merchant. Sometimes they set up small booths near the church or market square. Other times, they were invited directly into homes to examine the sick and offer what remedies they had. The life of a traveling doctor was both rewarding and difficult. They had no fixed shelter and often slept in inns, stables, or wherever hospitality was offered. They carried only what they could manage on horseback or by foot, a few key tools, pouches of dried herbs, perhaps a handwritten book or two. Their patients were many and varied: young children with fevers, farmers with broken bones, elderly villagers with fading eyesight or aching joints. Every stop brought a new challenge, a new mystery to solve, and a new set of personalities to navigate. These doctors had to be good listeners, for in unfamiliar communities, trust was not automatic. They learned to read people quickly, to adjust their tone and presence to suit each household. In some places, they were treated with reverence, welcomed with food and small gifts. In others, they were met with suspicion, their foreign ways viewed cautiously by tight-knit families. A successful traveling doctor needed not only knowledge but also tact, humility, and strong people skills. One wrong word could close a door. One successful treatment could open a dozen more. Language and dialect posed another challenge. The further a doctor traveled, the more likely they were to encounter different regional tongues or accents. Many healers spoke Latin, the language of medicine, but their patients did not. Communication required patience and creativity. Doctors used gestures, drawings, and even local interpreters to understand symptoms and explain remedies. Over time, some became fluent in multiple languages or developed their own shorthand systems for recording cases. One of the most unique aspects of the traveling doctor's life was how they gathered knowledge. Unlike doctors tied to one community or school, traveling healers encountered countless traditions, home remedies, and cultural beliefs. They learned from midwives, monks, and other wanderers. They observed how different regions treated the same illness, and took notes on what seemed to work. A remedy learned in the forests of Germany might find new life in the vineyards of France. In this way, traveling doctors became bridges between distant communities, sharing ideas and improving their craft as they went. Some wandering healers were part of larger networks, including trade guilds, religious orders, or even royal routes. Others worked entirely alone, driven by necessity, faith, or a desire to help. A few traveled with assistants, apprentices, siblings, or friends, who helped carry supplies, tend to patients, or collect herbs along the way. These partnerships brought companionship and safety, especially in remote areas where roads were poorly maintained and danger could arise from weather, wild animals, or unfriendly strangers. To support themselves, traveling doctors charged modest fees, often adjusted based on a family's ability to pay. In many cases, they accepted goods instead of coins: eggs, bread, wool, candles, or livestock. Others worked partly for charity, especially during plagues or in impoverished regions. Reputation was everything. Word spread quickly about a healer's success or failure. A doctor who cured a noble's son might be invited to stay on as a household physician. One who failed too often might find doors closed to them across an entire valley. Many traveling doctors also attended fairs and festivals, where they set up booths and offered treatments to large crowds. These public events allowed them to advertise their services, sell prepared remedies, or offer brief consultations. Some even gave demonstrations, showing how to bind a wound or prepare a tonic. These moments mixed education with performance, drawing crowds and building reputation. Of course, not all such healers were honest. Some were more showman than doctor, offering miracle cures and disappearing before results could be judged. But many were genuine in their intent, using these gatherings to reach people who might otherwise never see a healer. Medical kits for traveling doctors were both practical and symbolic. A doctor might carry a urinal flask, a few small blades, a wooden stethoscope, and carefully wrapped bundles of dried herbs. Some had leather scrolls with diagrams of the body, folded and worn from years of use. Others carried tokens or charms, personal items that offered comfort, protection, or reminders of home. These kits were often organized with meticulous care, not only for ease of use but as a sign of the doctor's seriousness. Patients judged a healer by their tools as much as by their words. Despite the hardships, many traveling doctors found deep satisfaction in their work. The variety of cases, the constant movement, and the opportunity to serve made their lives rich with meaning. They saw the countryside in all seasons, met people of every background, and were part of life's most intimate moments: birth, illness, recovery, and death. Their journeys were filled with stories of a baby saved with a last-minute remedy, of a wound stitched in the glow of a lantern, of a mother's tearful thanks after her child's fever broke. In some traditions, these doctors became legends. Tales were told of healers who arrived at just the right moment, whose remedies seemed almost magical, and who disappeared before anyone could repay them. Songs, poems, and prayers were inspired by their visits. Even skeptical villagers might keep an eye out for the return of the wandering doctor with the green bag, or the old woman with the silver ring and the soothing voice. Over time, these stories blended fact and myth, but they reflected the impact such healers had on the people they served. Occasionally, traveling doctors were summoned by the nobility. A letter or messenger might arrive, requesting the presence of a healer for a lord, lady, or child. These invitations were both an honor and a risk. Success could lead to favor and reward. Failure could lead to blame, or worse. A smart doctor approached these opportunities with humility, bringing their best remedies and their calmest voice. In noble courts, appearances mattered. A healer's clothing, manner, and speech were all scrutinized. Some learned to carry a second set of robes or accessories to appear more refined when needed. The end of a traveling doctor's career varied. Some settled down in one place after years on the road, building a small practice or passing their knowledge to a student. Others continued traveling into old age, known and welcomed wherever they went. A few faded into obscurity, their names forgotten but their work remembered in stories and gratitude. And though their journeys left few written records, their presence lingered in the lives they touched. The fevers calmed, the wounds mended, the lonely comforted by a steady voice and a practiced hand. In the grand picture of medieval medicine, these traveling doctors remind us that healing was not confined to cities or institutions. They rode on horseback, walked through muddy roads, and arrived with little more than a kind word and a satchel of herbs. Their work was humble, mobile, and deeply human. In every village they visited, they brought not only knowledge, but hope, the kind that arrives when someone knocks at the door and says, "I've come to help." In the Middle Ages, medicine and religion were not separate realms of thought. They were deeply intertwined, forming a shared framework through which people understood life, health, illness, and death. For the medieval doctor, this meant that every diagnosis, every treatment, and every moment beside a patient's bed existed not just in the world of the physical body, but also in the world of the soul. Understanding the role of religion in medicine was essential, not only to treat the sick effectively but also to speak the same language of belief and meaning that permeated the hearts of those who sought care. Religion was not simply a backdrop, it was the foundation upon which medicine stood. The prevailing belief of the time was that health was a gift from God, and illness, while painful, was often viewed as a spiritual trial or even a divine punishment for sin. This belief extended beyond individual suffering to whole communities. When plagues struck or strange illnesses spread, people searched for spiritual explanations. Were the afflicted being tested? Was the community being punished for impiety? Were unseen forces at work, perhaps spirits or demons sent to unsettle the faithful? These questions shaped not only how people thought about disease but also how doctors were expected to respond. Doctors themselves, though grounded in practical knowledge, were often believers. Many had studied in monasteries or been taught by religious scholars. They began and ended their days with prayer and sometimes carried religious tokens for protection. Some wore small crosses tucked beneath their robes. Others kept miniature books of psalms or holy texts in their medical bags. Before treating a patient, a doctor might offer a short prayer or ask for divine guidance in determining the cause of the illness. This was not considered separate from science. It was a natural part of the healing process. Hospitals in medieval Europe were frequently founded and operated by religious institutions. These were places of both healing and spiritual refuge. Patients were given food, a clean bed, and basic care. but they were also encouraged to confess their sins, receive last rites if needed, and participate in daily prayers. Monks and nuns tended to the sick alongside visiting physicians, ensuring that both body and soul received attention. A doctor treating someone in such a setting had to coordinate not only with fellow medical practitioners but also with members of the church. Respect for spiritual authority was expected, and collaboration was common. Illnesses of the mind and behavior, what today might be understood as mental health challenges, were especially steeped in religious meaning. A person who acted irrationally, heard voices, or suffered from deep sadness might be thought to be under the influence of demonic forces. In such cases, a doctor might be expected to consult with a priest or even step back to allow religious rituals to take precedence. Exorcisms, prayers of protection, and blessings were administered to restore spiritual balance. Some doctors believed fully in this approach, while others quietly questioned it, but in either case, navigating these situations required careful attention to the expectations of the patient, the family, and the broader community. Religious festivals and holy days also shaped medical practice. On feast days, certain foods were forbidden or fasting was encouraged, which had an effect on patients' health. A doctor had to be mindful of these traditions when advising diets or schedules. Certain saints were associated with healing, like Saint Sebastian, often invoked during times of plague, or Saint Dymphna, prayed to for mental distress. Patients and doctors alike might light candles or make offerings at local shrines in hopes of securing divine favor. In many homes, small icons or painted images of saints stood beside jars of herbs and other remedies. It was common for patients to carry religious amulets, say prayers over their medicine, or ask for blessings before taking a prescribed tincture. Pilgrimage was another religious tradition with medical significance. People suffering from chronic or mysterious ailments often journeyed to holy sites known for miracles. Doctors sometimes advised such pilgrimages themselves, especially when other treatments failed. Though these journeys could be physically demanding, they offered spiritual hope and the comfort of community. Some believed that bathing in the waters of a sacred spring or touching a saint's relic could bring healing. In these moments, the doctor became less of a healer and more of a guide, helping the patient prepare for a journey that was equal parts physical and spiritual. Religious belief also influenced how death was approached. In medieval times, dying was seen not only as a medical event but as a sacred transition. Doctors were expected to recognize the signs of approaching death and to step back when it became clear that no physical cure could be given. At this point, spiritual care took precedence. A priest was called to offer final rites, family members gathered to say prayers, and candles were lit to guide the soul. Doctors were often present for these moments, not as miracle workers but as witnesses to the end of life, offering comfort and respect. Their role was to ensure dignity, to ease suffering where possible, and to honor the beliefs that gave meaning to the patient's final hours. One of the most complex aspects of the relationship between religion and medicine was the issue of sin and healing. Many people believed that confession and repentance were essential to recovery. A person might be encouraged to reflect on their actions, seek forgiveness, and restore broken relationships in order to regain health. Doctors sometimes advise spiritual cleansing as part of their treatment, recommending that patients speak with a priest or make amends for past wrongs. This could be a delicate matter. While some patients welcomed the opportunity to reflect, others resisted the implication that they were to blame for their suffering. A wise doctor had to approach these moments with sensitivity, never judging but gently guiding. Religious rules could also create conflict. Some treatments, such as the use of animal products, bloodletting, or astrology, were questioned or condemned by certain religious authorities. Doctors had to navigate these restrictions carefully, choosing their methods in accordance with both medical knowledge and spiritual acceptability. In some regions, religious councils reviewed medical practices and could discipline doctors who crossed certain lines. At the same time, many religious leaders supported medical advancement and saw the work of healing as aligned with divine will. The challenge was to find the right balance, to honor tradition while exploring new ways to ease suffering. Despite these complexities, the influence of religion on healing was often a source of strength. It provided comfort to the ill, structure to the doctor's work, and a shared language that united communities. When a patient feared death, belief in an afterlife offered hope. When a cure was not possible, faith offered peace. When medicine failed, prayer remained. Doctors who embraced this relationship with reverence and care found that their work was made deeper, not smaller. They were not just treating bodies, they were caring for souls. Even as universities emerged and medical science began to evolve, the spiritual dimension of healing remained. Students learned not only the names of herbs and the diagrams of veins, but also the teachings of church doctrine and the prayers for the sick. Professors debated medical theory alongside moral philosophy. Libraries contained not only surgical texts but also books on divine grace and spiritual ethics. The best doctors were those who could blend knowledge with compassion, skill with humility, and science with faith. For many, this integration was not seen as a burden but a blessing. It gave meaning to their work, rooted it in service, and reminded them that every act of healing was part of something greater. Whether curing a cough, setting a bone, or holding a hand at life's end, the doctor acted not alone but alongside the divine. This belief infused every visit, every treatment, and every moment of hope. In the end, the religious framework of medieval medicine reminds us that healing has always been more than a technical task. It is a relationship between doctor and patient, body and spirit, humanity and the sacred. The tools may change, the language may evolve, but the heart of the work remains the same: to care, to comfort, and to walk with others through the hardest moments of their lives. As the Middle Ages gradually gave way to the Renaissance, the world around medieval doctors began to shift. New ideas were stirring in Europe, fueled by exploration, invention, and renewed curiosity about the ancient world. Science began to pull away from tradition. Scholars started to question long-held beliefs. But even as medical theories changed, and new tools were invented, the memory of the medieval doctor remained. His robes, his bag of herbs, his long nights beside the sick, these images lingered, preserved in old manuscripts and retold in stories passed down through generations. He was a figure both practical and symbolic, representing a time when medicine was practiced not in laboratories or hospitals, but in kitchens, gardens, monasteries, and humble cottages. The legacy of the medieval doctor is built on quiet resilience. Working with limited resources, guided by theories inherited from centuries past, and often facing challenges that overwhelmed even the bravest of hearts, he continued to care. He continued to show up. To the bedsides of strangers, to the fields where the injured lay, to the cloisters where prayers mixed with the scent of rosemary and lavender. His treatments might seem strange by modern standards: bloodletting, astrology, and crushed beetles, but behind these practices was a deeply human desire to heal. The medieval doctor believed in balance, in order, in harmony between the body, the stars, the seasons, and the soul. His world was smaller than ours, but it was no less intricate. The work of the medieval doctor was shaped by layers of responsibility. He was not only a physician but often a counselor, a priest, a witness to grief, and a bearer of hope. In villages with no hospital and only a single road, he was the one people turned to in their darkest moments. He did not promise miracles. He did not always have answers. But he came anyway. Sometimes with a calming hand. Sometimes with a bitter draught. Sometimes with nothing more than his presence. In a time when disease could not be explained and cures were few, that presence mattered. It was often the first step toward comfort, the first sign that someone cared enough to try. Even his mistakes shaped the future. The flawed ideas of humors and planetary medicine eventually gave way to more scientific methods, but they laid a foundation. They taught doctors to observe, to record, to think critically about the body. The diagrams in medieval medical texts, however inaccurate, sparked discussions. The herbal recipes, preserved on parchment or carved into woodblocks, became stepping stones toward pharmacology. The discipline of the medieval doctor, his habit of note-taking and case study writing, helped establish the routines that would later become clinical standards. The apprentices trained by medieval doctors would go on to teach the next generation. Some of them traveled to cities where anatomy was beginning to be studied more closely. Some contributed to the translation of Arabic texts that held more advanced knowledge of surgery and disease. Others simply kept practicing, passing on their insights to sons, nephews, or students. The slow ripple of learning moved outward, connecting distant corners of Europe through shared cures, shared failures, and shared stories. Hospitals began to evolve too. No longer just places of charity and prayer, they started to incorporate formal care systems. Secular doctors began to work alongside clergy. Anatomy was taught using real bodies. Medical schools adopted more structured curricula. But many of the values held by medieval doctors remained: patience, compassion, humility, and the willingness to admit what they did not yet understand. These values were never outdated. They were timeless. Some of the language used by medieval doctors still echoes today. Terms like melancholy, sanguine, and choleric have their roots in the theory of humors. Though we no longer use them to diagnose, they remind us of a time when emotions and health were viewed as part of a unified whole. The idea that the mind and body are connected, a truth modern medicine now confirms, was already being explored by doctors centuries ago. Their methods were limited, but their insights were often profound. The public image of the medieval doctor has changed over time. In some paintings and stories, he is shown as a mysterious figure, masked and robed, navigating darkened streets during a plague. In others, he is a kindly old man with a pouch of herbs, speaking softly to a sick child. Both images hold truth. He was part science, part myth. His role was as much emotional as it was medical. In a world filled with fear and uncertainty, he represented care, and care, even without a cure, is a powerful thing. Even the smallest acts left lasting impressions. A warm broth prepared in a monastery kitchen. A hand pressed to a burning forehead. A piece of advice whispered to a mother sitting at her child's side. These were the moments that stayed with people. Medicine, after all, is not just about breakthroughs and discoveries. It's about service. And the medieval doctor, with all his imperfections and outdated ideas, understood that deeply. As centuries passed, the tools changed. The theories changed. The classrooms changed. But the heart of medicine remained. The desire to help, to heal, to be useful in the face of suffering, this did not change. It was there in the hands that mixed herbs, in the voices that sang prayers, in the scribbled notes passed between healers. It is still there now, in hospitals and homes, in clinics and quiet rooms. The medieval doctor's story reminds us that medicine is not only found in technology, but in relationships. In showing up. In listening. In doing one's best with what is available. There is also a quiet nobility in the limits of medieval medicine. These doctors did not have microscopes, vaccines, or clean surgical suites. Yet they faced down disease with the tools they had. They endured plagues, injuries, and widespread suffering with courage. Many risked their lives again and again, not because they were promised glory, but because they felt called to act. Their legacy is not only scientific but moral. It is the reminder that every healer, no matter their tools, begins with the same impulse: to ease pain. Even today, echoes of the medieval doctor can be felt in places we may not expect. In herbal gardens tended by modern botanists. In quiet wards where nurses sit by patients late into the night. In the careful records kept by doctors still learning from their patients. In medical ethics courses that emphasize compassion alongside clinical skill. In small villages across the world where the local healer is still the most trusted figure in town. The spirit of the medieval doctor lives on wherever medicine is practiced with humility and heart. And what of the patients? Their stories, too, are part of the legacy. Those who waited for a doctor's arrival. Those who sat quietly, hoping the herbs would work. Those who found peace through prayer when medicine failed. Their faith and care, whether in the doctor, the treatment, or something greater, carried medicine forward. Without their trust, their cooperation, and their hope, even the best doctors could do little. Healing, after all, is a partnership. The Middle Ages have long since ended, but their doctors still speak to us. They tell us that healing is not just a science but an act of service. That knowledge, no matter how flawed, can grow when shared with care. That even in the absence of certainty, effort and compassion still matter. They remind us that medicine is a human story, messy, evolving, and full of quiet courage. As we close this chapter on what it was like to be a medieval doctor, we carry with us not only a sense of history but a sense of continuity. Though centuries and technologies may divide us, the call to heal remains the same. Whether in a stone cottage by candlelight or a modern clinic filled with screens, the work is still sacred. And it all began with figures in robes and sandals, carrying satchels filled with herbs, and walking miles to reach the bedside of someone in need. And now, as we close the pages of this quiet journey, take a slow, deep breath. Let the images fade, of flickering lanterns, herbal gardens, silent cloisters, and the steady footsteps of doctors moving through cobbled streets. Their world was slower, softer, and full of quiet determination. Even in the face of uncertainty, they showed up, with a satchel, a prayer, and the hope of healing. You've wandered alongside them, through misty forests and echoing stone corridors, seen the candles lit beside the sick, and heard the hush of whispered remedies passed from hand to hand. Now let the weight of the past settle gently behind you. You are safe, you are still, and you are far from the worries of today. May your rest be deep and peaceful, and may the quiet strength of those who came before bring you comfort through the night. Good night.